In a pine-shrouded valley 5 miles north of Dillsboro, Indiana, the St. Joseph Retreat Center was built in 1901 as a place of silence, renewal, and penance for men of the cloth. The surrounding hills muffled sound, and the local townspeople rarely ventured close. By 1977, 29 clergy assigned to St. Joseph had vanished from records, parishes, and even family memory. No formal investigations were ever launched. All missing were men between the ages of 30 and 60, all sent to the retreat for spiritual recalibration. No explanation was ever offered to parishioners, no next of kin ever filed charges, no body was ever found. On paper, the St. Joseph Retreat Center was one of the most respected facilities operated under the regional archdiocese, promoted for its work in spiritual care for troubled vocations. Promotional materials featured sweeping aerial shots of its stone cloister, serene reflection pools, and large chapel, modeled after early Spanish missions. Brochures distributed to seminaries in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky presented St. Joseph as a final resort before a priest was reassigned or returned to public ministry. Journal articles in religious periodicals described the center as pioneering, compassionate, and deeply rooted in traditional values. Clergy who completed the retreat program were said to return with renewed humility and vocational vigor. The St. Joseph Retreat Center officially opened its doors on April 12, 1901. Designed by ecclesiastical architect Barnabas Fields, the complex included dormitories, private hermitages, administrative quarters, and a cavernous sanctuary built with Indiana limestone. It was commissioned by Bishop Harold Martin, who at the time oversaw one of the largest diocesan territories in the Midwest. Archival letters between Martin and regional abbots suggest the retreat was envisioned less as a place of punishment than a space of silence where moral and pastoral deficiencies might be addressed in isolation. The surrounding grounds spanned 47 acres, with sections partitioned for reflection, labor, and penitence. A small working farm on the east edge was tended by clergy during their stay. Behind the main chapel, a path led into a thick woodland trail, ending in a stone arch engraved with the phrase Veritas Libera Vos. Few locals knew the grounds in detail. Deliveries were made at the perimeter. Visitors were restricted to a narrow parlor near the main entrance. For most residents of Dillsboro and surrounding Jackson County, the facility was something they recognized by silhouette only. In early documents, the retreat center is described as an essential remedy for men afflicted by the spiritual confusions of modernity. The term spiritual confusion was never officially defined, though internal reports obtained decades later included vague references to emotional irregularity, liturgical dissent, and doctrinal fatigue. By 1910, the retreat had already processed more than 80 clergy from across Indiana and Kentucky. Most stayed for periods of 9 months to 1 year. Only a select few returned to diocesan assignments. Most were reassigned to monastery duties or placed under indefinite observation within affiliated abbeys. Despite its remote nature, the retreat center maintained a favorable reputation through much of the early century. Letters from seminary rectors praised the moral clarity and ascetic rigor the facility encouraged. Retreat alumni were occasionally asked to speak at vocational conferences, though their sessions were often brief, usually under supervision, and never touched on their time in Dillsboro directly. The silence, it seemed, was not just a spiritual discipline. It was policy. By the 1950s, attendance shifted. Files suggest an increase in referrals from urban dioceses experiencing excessive attrition and clerical collapse. Internal memoranda written between 1953 and 1957 refer to a pilot treatment track tested on select individuals exhibiting what were termed critical moral deviations. Again, the terminology lacks clarity. In none of the documents is the term defined, but records from this period note increased collaboration with psychological consultants from unnamed private firms. One invoice from April 1956 refers to monthly evaluations, sleep protocol, and dietary recalibration conducted under contract with the retreat. No details were preserved beyond the invoice itself. Still, the public image held. The center remained in directories of approved ecclesiastical rehabilitation sites well into the 1970s. Brochures published in 1971 present the same pastoral serenity: tiled cloisters, hushed corridors, and men kneeling in solitary chapels. Even as new facilities opened in larger cities, St. Joseph held on to its reputation as a sacred site of quiet reform. What few noticed, however, was that names had stopped returning. The first disappearance officially recorded, though never publicly acknowledged, occurred in August 1954. Father Alan Sorrell, age 41, assigned to St. Mark's in Evansville, had been referred to the retreat following what was vaguely termed exhaustive incongruity with parish expectations. His file indicates he arrived at St. Joseph on July 3, 1954. A single postcard, postmarked July 21st, was sent to his sister in Cleveland, in which he wrote briefly of the stone paths and persistent cicadas. After that, nothing. Diocesan logs merely state that he remained in spiritual residence indefinitely. No date of death was listed. Over the next 2 decades, 28 more priests, deacons, and visiting brothers disappeared in similarly silent increments. The files were methodical but spare. Each man had been referred to St. Joseph between 1954 and 1977. Each was between the ages of 30 and 60. Each had a documented arrival, and most had 1 to 3 pieces of outgoing correspondence, typically within the first 30 days. Then, silence. No death certificates, no retirement notations, no transfer orders. By 1977, only 2 of the original clerics assigned between 1954 and 1965 were still on public record, both listed as inactive due to health and supervision. Attempts to question this pattern internally were few and swiftly curtailed. In one case, Father David Renner, who had served as assistant to the retreat's director in the late 1960s, submitted a memo suggesting troubling inconsistencies in record-keeping and sacramental access. Within 2 months, Renner had been reassigned to a small mission in southern Louisiana. He never spoke publicly again. Those who left the retreat and did re-enter ministry seldom made reference to the center. One such case, Father James Corbin, was interviewed anonymously for a seminary oral history project in 1993. His transcribed remarks described the facility as detached from time and regulated in a way that made you forget you ever served anywhere else. When asked what daily life entailed, he replied, "You worked, you prayed, you sat in silence. You didn't ask about the ones who didn't come back to meals. Why were no investigations launched? The answer lies partly in jurisdiction. The retreat operated under internal canonical procedures that required no civil disclosure. Families of the missing clergy were given vague reassurances of long-term spiritual reassignment. In some cases, pensions continued. In others, bank accounts were closed quietly. It was assumed, or at least made to appear, that these men had simply chosen a life of deeper isolation. But by 1977, enough quiet inquiries had emerged that the pattern could no longer be entirely buried. By the early 1970s, unease surrounding St. Joseph Retreat Center had reached the periphery of diocesan governance, though never its center. Mid-level clergy in administrative positions, particularly those responsible for clerical placements and pensions, began to encounter quiet discrepancies. One such official, a finance clerk named Theodore Yancey, noted that several pension accounts were being maintained for clergy, whose official locations were listed only as St. Joseph, no transfer, a designation that contradicted both canonical norms and fiscal procedures. Yancey submitted a routine inquiry to the Diocesan Office of Temporal Affairs. His letter was returned unopened with a note, "Filed already. Do not duplicate." Over time, even the postal system began to absorb signs that something was irregular. Between 1968 and 1975, 8 families submitted claims to the Jackson County Clerk's Office for missing mail directed to relatives believed to be staying at St. Joseph. The mail had not been returned, nor acknowledged. One claim involved a package containing photographs and letters from the children of Father Adrian Blaine, a widower ordained later in life. The package was addressed and tracked through a now-defunct courier firm based in Indianapolis. It was signed for, but no acknowledgement from Blaine was ever received. 2 years later, a diocesan letter confirmed that Father Blaine had entered long-term contemplation with no location given. A critical shift occurred in 1973 when a short article appeared in the Dillsborough Gazette. The piece, buried near the classifieds, referenced the construction of new fencing along the eastern boundary of the retreat's property. A single line drew passing attention. Contractors report being turned away before entering interior forest path, despite holding valid work orders. The article was written by a local freelancer named Glenna White, who, according to archived letters, attempted to conduct interviews with former groundskeepers and maintenance staff. None agreed to speak on record. Within a month, White left the area. Her byline did not appear again. What becomes increasingly difficult to ignore during this period is the pattern of erasure. Each man sent to the retreat arrived with a known background. Parishes knew them. Families knew them. They had roles, assignments, and paper trails. Yet within weeks of their arrival, the traceable evidence of their lives began to wither. Records that once existed were replaced with notations like spiritual redeployment or vocational sabbatical. These terms had no formal definition in ecclesiastical handbooks. They served as placeholders, a kind of soft denial that anything had changed. Even medical records disappeared. An inquiry in 1975 by a retired parish nurse from Louisville revealed that Father Maurice Eddins, last known to be at St. Joseph, had been removed from the hospital registry of a Catholic care facility he once frequented for chronic respiratory issues. The nurse, who had kept copies of old files, discovered that not only had Eddins's records vanished from the facility's archive, but his name had also been erased from insurance forms and support rosters. When she contacted the Archdiocese, she received a brief letter thanking her for her diligence in upholding the privacy of all ordained persons under discernment. Behind the outer facade of reverence and isolation, there were additional structural changes. Aerial photographs taken by state geological survey teams in 1969 and 1974 show distinct modifications to the landscape. In the earlier image, 3 outbuildings line the northeast quadrant of the retreat grounds. By 1974, only 2 remain. No permits were filed for demolition. Soil grading in the surrounding area suggests substantial excavation, later covered with uniform sod and stone. A line of 7 small trees, all evenly spaced, was planted where the structure once stood. A former seminary classmate of one of the missing, writing under the pseudonym H.G., recalled in a 1991 letter that he had driven near the retreat in 1976 on a personal road trip. He remembered stopping at a gas station in nearby Versailles, where a man in clerical attire, thin and visibly trembling, purchased a bus ticket to Cincinnati. The name given at the counter was Franklin Jude, not listed in any diocesan records. H.G. claimed the man looked vaguely familiar and bore a resemblance to a deacon who had been assigned to St. Joseph 5 years prior. No follow-up was made. The ticket stub, found in H.G.'s personal effects after his death, listed only Franklin J. one way. The retreat's public presence during this time was minimal. It hosted no open houses, issued no newsletters, and participated in no diocesan events. Even its listing in national clergy directories began to shorten. Where earlier entries included facility details and director names, later editions reduced the entry to Private Ecclesiastical Retreat, closed to public. 1 year it was omitted entirely, then reappeared the following year with no explanation. Despite these signs, the retreat remained functional. Power bills were paid. Minor permits were filed for plumbing and irrigation upgrades. A single hiring notice appeared in the Courier Journal in 1976, seeking a grounds and supply assistant able to perform discreetly under religious protocols. The name of the hiring institution was omitted. The listed phone number connected to a forwarding service in New Albany. What lingered most among those who had touched the edges of the retreat, however, was not the physical oddity of its structures, nor the evasiveness of its record-keeping. It was the silence of those who had returned. A handful of clergy who had completed terms at St. Joseph between 1950 and 1970 were still alive in 1977. Efforts to interview them yielded polite refusals, brief nods or gestures of unease. One, a former liturgy instructor in Terre Haute, stated plainly, "There were corridors there that didn't end where they should have. There were times for meals, and then there were times no one was allowed to eat. We obeyed the bell, that's all I can say. Another, who spoke anonymously to a novice monk in 1980, described the retreat's daily structure in ritualistic terms. We worked, we sat in quarters, we submitted monthly reports, not to the bishop, but to an internal clerk we never saw twice. When asked what the reports contained, the man answered, "Thoughts, dreams, doubts." He later recanted the entire conversation and refused further contact. In 1977, an unexpected administrative transfer occurred. The director of the retreat, Father Raymond Moen, was reassigned to a teaching position in Rome. His departure coincided with a temporary closure of the facility for repairs and recalibration. For 6 months, the retreat remained shuttered. During that time, a single semi-truck bearing no visible logo entered the grounds twice, both times accompanied by security personnel wearing plain suits. No records of delivery or pickup were filed. When St. Joseph reopened in early 1978, it no longer accepted new referrals. The facility was renamed internally as the Center for Reflective Ecclesial Practice. The name never appeared in public directories. Former staff were rotated out. The chapel bell, once rung hourly, was dismantled. And yet, no official acknowledgement was ever made regarding the men who had vanished. Their names remained buried in footnotes, coded in internal memos, or omitted entirely from final clerical rosters. Each had once served the public. Each had walked the halls of rectories, baptized infants, consoled grieving families, presided at weddings. Each had believed that the retreat would help them return whole. None did. In the spring of 1978, 3 months after St. Joseph reopened under its new internal designation, a series of letters began arriving at the Chancery office of a mid-sized diocese in northern Kentucky. Each envelope bore no return address, and each letter was signed with the same initials, JCR. The contents were unevenly typed, some paragraphs misaligned, others faded into the margins, but the message was unmistakable. They warned of unaccounted men beneath silent corridors, referenced rooms that could not be unlocked from the inside, and described in vague but insistent terms a cycle of induced absence that had operated without interruption since at least 1955. The letters were logged, filed under miscellaneous grievances, and placed into a non-priority archive. But a junior administrator, recently ordained and unfamiliar with protocol, made an unofficial copy and shared it with a faculty member at the seminary in Covington. That faculty member, a historian of religious institutions named Elias Hart, kept the letter in a locked drawer for years. He would later claim that the typography of the documents matched that of an old Remington Model 7 typewriter previously located in the retreat's East Wing office. The existence of the JCR letters might have faded into obscurity had it not been for a second wave of correspondence, this time addressed directly to family members of former clergy associated with St. Joseph. The letters arrived sporadically over several years, often in unmarked envelopes and on plain stationery. The tone was consistent, restrained, cautious, and oddly formal. One such letter, received in 1982 by the niece of Father Emmett Granger, included a single phrase that triggered her suspicion. He was asked to carry more than any man should. Until that point, Granger's family had accepted the diocesan explanation that he had voluntarily joined a contemplative order overseas. No such order could ever be located. The niece, who had kept a box of her uncle's effects, returned to it that same evening and discovered an unsent letter in his handwriting dated July 15, 1965. The letter, never mailed, referenced his upcoming reassignment to the restoration site near Dillsborough. He had circled the word restoration 3 times. The use of language became one of the few surviving clues. Many of the official notations used to describe clergy sent to St. Joseph deviated subtly from common ecclesiastical terminology. Instead of sabbatical or reassignment, forms often included phrases such as under-renewal, withdrawn to process, or post-conciliar grounding. These were not used in other diocesan documents and appeared exclusively in cases linked to the retreat. A retired records clerk from Cincinnati, interviewed in 1991, stated that such language began appearing in the mid-1950s and had no precedent in prior filing systems. Another signal came in the form of a chart discovered among the estate documents of Bishop Francis Weldon, who served the southern Indiana region during the retreat's most active period. The chart listed names, dates, and a simple three-color coding system, green, amber, red. No key was provided. 32 names were marked, 29 in red. All 29 had been traced to the St. Joseph Retreat Center. The 3 marked in green had been reassigned to diocesan schools. None had ever spoken publicly about their time in Dillsborough. One of the green-coded individuals, Father Owen Lafferty, eventually relocated to a small parish in rural Vermont. In a rare interview conducted under anonymity in 1993, he described a daily regimen of silence, strict isolation, and what he called psycho-spiritual evaluations that involved prolonged periods without direct interaction. When asked how long he had remained at the retreat, he hesitated before answering. "They told me it was 6 months, but I remember 13 winters." Other signals were not linguistic, but architectural. A maintenance contractor named Russell Mears, who worked briefly at St. Joseph in 1972, recalled a discrepancy in the layout of the dormitory wings. According to his contract, the East Wing contained 14 residential quarters. Yet while conducting routine plumbing repairs, Mears discovered a 15th door, unmarked and recessed between utility panels. It bore no signage, no number, and resisted all standard keys. He reported the anomaly to a supervisor. The next day he was informed his services were no longer required. His final paycheck included a handwritten note. No further action needed. By the early 1980s, a pattern had become visible to those willing to piece it together. Independent researchers, mostly former seminarians and archivists, began compiling informal ledgers cross-referencing ordination years, last known assignments, and unexplained withdrawals. Their findings showed a concentration of unexplained disappearances, tightly grouped between 1954 and 1977. All roads led back to St. Joseph. Yet no disciplinary orders, canonical trials, or retirement notifications matched the names involved. What few institutional responses existed came only when external pressure emerged. In 1984, a regional historical journal published an article on the use of remote ecclesiastical facilities for disciplinary retreats. Though the piece never mentioned St. Joseph directly, its description of an anonymous complex located in the Indiana woodlands, where vocalization was prohibited and external correspondence censored, sparked interest. Within weeks, the publisher received a cease and desist letter from an unnamed legal counsel, citing breach of diocesan confidentiality. The author of the article withdrew from public life shortly thereafter. Among the most chilling confirmations of irregularity came from a series of dated financial ledgers housed in the administrative archives of a monastery affiliated with St. Joseph. In these records, several line items between 1962 and 1975 are marked only as containment stipends. The amounts varied, but were significantly higher than standard clerical wages. One entry from October 1971 lists a payment for non-returned ordinance. Researchers later concluded that the phrase may have referred to clergy who had failed to exit the retreat or whose status had been internally reclassified. The notion of reclassification became a focal point. Canonical law provides mechanisms for laicization, exclaustration, or reassignment, but none of these statuses applied to the 29 men traced to St. Joseph. Instead, they were marked by silence, no final statements, no exit evaluations, no confirmations of death. Even within the internal database maintained by the Episcopal Conference, these individuals were listed only as inactive, without detail. Some began to suspect that the silence was not just procedural, but cultivated. A former administrator at the retreat, who agreed to speak under pseudonym in a sealed deposition later obtained by researchers, described a culture of managed amnesia. "You were told what to forget," he said. "You were trained to stop asking where Father X had gone. You assumed he was transferred even if his coat was still hanging by the door. When asked who gave these instructions, he paused. Not a who, a protocol. You learned not to break the rhythm." As the decade closed, public awareness remained limited. Families who asked questions were met with polite assurances and references to discernment paths. No official investigation was launched. No public inquiry made. The retreat center continued to operate under reduced capacity, its gates still locked, its bell still silent. But the signals kept surfacing. In 1986, a former facilities supplier named Jerome Callan reached out to a retired auxiliary bishop in Ohio. Callan had spent 8 years managing deliveries of maintenance chemicals and medical-grade disinfectants to institutions across the tri-state area. Among his routes was a quarterly shipment to St. Joseph Retreat. The orders, he noted, were always large, disproportionately so for a center with fewer than 40 listed occupants. More unusual, however, was the request that all deliveries be scheduled between the hours of 4 and 6 a.m., and that drivers wait outside the outer perimeter for an attendant in plain dress to retrieve the cargo. In his correspondence, Callan emphasized a detail he had long considered an anomaly, but had never voiced. Each shipment required a co-signature, not from the retreat itself, but from a separate entity, listed only as DM Custodial Oversight. No public registry matched the name. Callan attempted to contact the vendor listed on one of the invoices. The phone number had been disconnected. The address traced to a demolished printing warehouse in southern Indianapolis. When Callan mentioned this to other delivery personnel who had serviced similar routes, 2 acknowledged seeing the same name on paperwork connected to rural monastic sites. Both recalled the retreat as the most secretive and subdued among them. One described an incident where he had mistakenly stepped 5 paces beyond the unloading area and was immediately confronted by a man who identified himself only as Brother Simon. The man carried no visible identification and spoke in a tone that suggested prior military training. The driver was instructed to turn around and not return. That same year, a graduate student in religious studies at a private university in Indiana began compiling what she called shadow rosters, lists of clergy whose files indicated incomplete vocational paths. Her research originally focused on broader trends of clerical attrition in the post-conciliar period. However, as she reviewed ordination records and compared them with subsequent public postings, a pattern emerged. There were clergy who had vanished from the directory not at retirement age, not after illness, not after formal laicization, but in mid-service. Their last official designation transferred to Dillsborough. The student, whose name was omitted from the published version of her thesis, included an appendix listing 27 names with documented assignment to St. Joseph between 1955 and 1975. None had completed further ministry, and only 2 had known burial sites. She contacted several diocesan offices requesting clarification. Most did not reply. One sent a single sentence: "These matters are closed." By 1988, researchers attempting to build a clearer picture of St. Joseph's internal operations ran into another layer of silence. Property deeds associated with the retreat showed multiple ownership transfers during the years in question. Though always nominally held under church authority, the managing trusts were frequently rotated between shell organizations. One, the Norvale Trust Company, operated for only 6 months before dissolving. Its registered agent was listed as H. Silex, a name not found in any clerical records. When contacted years later, a law firm that had processed one of the transfers stated that it could not confirm who had authorized the transaction, only that religious immunity provisions had been invoked. The invocation of immunity became a recurring obstacle. Canonical law allows certain internal matters to remain sealed under the auspices of spiritual care. However, multiple legal scholars questioned whether the use of such exemptions to obscure patterns of disappearance could be ethically defended. Still, no lawsuits were filed. Families remained reluctant. Fear of scandal, distrust of institutions, and the passage of time combined to dampen public reaction. Yet in private, the signals multiplied. A former seminarian who had briefly interned at St. Joseph in 1969 returned to the grounds in 1989, now as a married layman. He was granted a brief tour of the exterior chapel by a caretaker who by then was nearing retirement. During the visit, he asked about a particular hallway he remembered being closed off during his internship. The caretaker nodded, paused, and said only, "We used to lock it from both sides." When asked why, he replied, Some places weren't meant for silence, they were meant for forgetting. Later that year, an anonymous package arrived at the editorial office of a Midwest historical journal. Inside were 6 cassette tapes labeled with years: 1961, 1964, 1966, 1969, 1971, 1975. Each contained muffled audio recordings, some barely audible, featuring what appeared to be routine readings of scripture, interspersed with brief fragments of conversation. In one segment, a voice says, "He's not writing anymore." Another replies, "Then he will remain in place." No names are spoken. No context is given. The sender's identity was never discovered. Perhaps the most disturbing signal came from a routine land survey conducted in 1990. A development proposal near the northern boundary of St. Joseph's property required environmental clearance. During the survey, geologists detected an unusual series of subsoil anomalies consistent with sealed vaults or containment chambers. The anomalies formed a perfect rectangle, roughly the size of a dormitory basement. When the surveyors submitted a request to investigate further, the application was denied. The reason listed: sacred ground, exempt from excavation. The geologists, unfamiliar with ecclesiastical exemptions, sought legal advice. The council advised against pursuing the matter, noting that religious land protections in Indiana extended to any site designated for non-public spiritual functions. Without written permission from the retreat or its governing diocese, the land could not be disturbed. Among the few who pressed forward was a retired teacher whose brother had vanished after being sent to the retreat in 1962. She had long believed the official story, that he had taken vows in a reclusive order overseas, but after hearing of the anomalies from a family friend involved in the survey, she contacted the diocese. The reply she received was a form letter. The closing line read, "We are grateful for your family's contribution to the legacy of vocational discernment." By the end of 1991, a loose network of independent researchers, family members, and former clergy had compiled the names of 29 men. Each shared 3 traits: assignment to St. Joseph, absence from all subsequent clerical records, and no documented cause of death. They began meeting informally in a church basement in Dayton, using borrowed liturgical directories and photocopied personnel logs. Their goal was not litigation. It was acknowledgement. One former monk, now employed as a librarian, brought a set of handwritten notes copied from the retreat's old reference library. The notes described a practice known internally as adaptive dormancy. The term, according to the notes, referred to extended isolation used to encourage total surrender of clerical ego. The intended outcome was listed as irreversible humility. Though no time frame was specified, a footnote mentioned that certain cases required deep protocol extensions exceeding standard reflection cycles. When the group attempted to publish a summary of their findings, no press outlet accepted. Editors cited lack of verifiable sources, risk of defamation, and the absence of official confirmation. One editor suggested that the mystery may be real, but mystery without names is merely rumor. The group continued its work privately. Throughout this period, the retreat itself grew quieter. No new clergy were assigned. Maintenance decreased. Aerial images from 1992 show significant overgrowth along the southern path and signs of deterioration on the eastern wall. A local teacher, leading a student field trip through the area, reported hearing bells at irregular intervals, despite the fact that the main chapel bell had been removed over a decade prior. She was told it was likely metal fatigue on old pipes. The field trip was not repeated. By 1993, the retreat was no longer listed in internal diocesan communications. It existed on paper, maintained by a legal trust, but its role was undefined. No clear administrator was named. Inquiries went unanswered. And yet, the gate remained closed. The outer perimeter was still maintained. The property was not sold. The silence remained curated, managed, intact. In January 1994, a former clerical auditor named Malcolm Fenwick submitted an anonymous envelope to a retired archivist living near Gary, Indiana. Inside were photocopies of 3 internal memoranda, each dated between 1960 and 1963. The documents bore the seal of an interdiocesan commission, a little-known clerical oversight body established during the post-war restructuring of regional seminaries. At first glance, the memoranda appeared routine: updates on monastic transfers, funding reallocations, and theological publication approvals. But one memo, marked confidential and dated September 3, 1962, included a single directive underlined twice: initiate containment review for long-term vocations under silence enforcement. This phrase, silence enforcement, did not appear in any known canon law compendium. The archivist, who had spent 3 decades indexing liturgical revisions, had never encountered the term. Its inclusion within a memo that referenced St. Joseph as a preferred environment for non-returning postulants raised immediate questions. He shared the findings with 2 researchers from the Dayton Group, who began a targeted investigation into oversight commissions operating between 1950 and 1975. The truth, they soon learned, was not hidden in destruction but in overclassification. Dozens of commission reports had been archived in minor diocesan facilities, sealed under routine confidentiality clauses, but never formally restricted. Among these was a volume of incident reports labeled Interior Realignment Outcomes, filed in a storage basement beneath the St. Tarcisius Seminary Library. Inside were lists of clergy identified not by name, but by numeric designation. Each entry contained brief behavioral summaries and a notation labeled R status. This status, as footnoted in a companion index, referred to inward reassignment. All 29 numeric entries shared the same destination code, SJR. The code was unmistakable: St. Joseph Retreat, R for removal, or retreat, or residence. The ambiguity served its function. One report dated November 1965 described a subject who no longer participates in peer sacramental recognition and displays flattened affect consistent with advanced interiorization. The recommendation read simply, extend cycle, maintain auditory minimization. While no names were included, cross-referencing the case number against travel reimbursement forms led to one match: a cleric from Lexington who disappeared in early 1966, last year, assigned to private reflection under restricted guidance. The pattern suggested more than silence. It suggested procedure. That same winter, a second piece of evidence surfaced. A former novitiate instructor from Evansville, nearing the end of his life, donated his collection of ecclesiastical handbooks to a local theological college. Among them was a privately printed volume titled Protocols for Terminal Discernment. Though undated and without attribution, the text included chapters on vocational halting, intraspiritual withdrawal, and final obedience compliance. A handwritten note inside the cover read, "For internal chapel use only. Return to SJ main office." The book's language bordered on clinical. When withdrawal is advanced beyond dialogical function, reassigned to non-liturgical roles, affirm compliance through weekly stillness forms. Discontinue name usage after 7th week. One passage instructed that if a cleric failed to demonstrate outward signs of doctrinal reintegration within a specified window, his inward obedience should be reinterpreted as perpetual. It was, in essence, a script for disappearance. Researchers compared the handbook to contemporary formation manuals and found no overlap. It was not listed in any seminary catalogue or theological publisher's record. A former spiritual director, contacted by letter, confirmed that he had once seen such a volume at St. Joseph, locked in a cabinet labelled Private Praxis. He refused to discuss its content, stating only that obedience without witness is not renewal, it is closure. By spring of 1995, attention shifted toward individuals who may have enforced the silence. One name that recurred across multiple marginal records was Father Kenneth Alvey. Not widely known, Alvey had served as the assistant director at St. Joseph between 1961 and 1972. Though absent from most diocesan newsletters, internal personnel directories listed him as lead for stillness observance. His responsibilities included managing intake protocols, conducting post-arrival evaluations, and overseeing what were termed interior days, periods of total non-verbal compliance. No photographs of Alve survived. Descriptions portray him as soft-spoken, immaculately organized, and seldom seen outside the retreat's interior passageways. A groundskeeper recalled that Alve often carried a small notebook with columns labeled response, adjustment, and yield. He spoke little, but his presence always preceded a cleric's shift to isolation quarters. After leaving St. Joseph, Alve briefly served as a confessor at a retirement abbey before disappearing from all subsequent records. His final known correspondence was addressed to the provincial office in Indianapolis. The letter, dated March 1973, contained a single sentence: "The corridor remains intact. The names are unspoken. The bell has ceased." This bell, frequently mentioned in oral histories, had once marked hours of prayer, meals, and reflection. Its cessation was not mechanical, it was symbolic. The silence was complete. Following these discoveries, the research group compiled a document known as the Dillsborough Ledger. It contained all verified details gathered across 4 years of inquiry. The names, dates, and final recorded actions of 29 clergy were listed alongside procedural notes and correlated anomalies. The ledger included testimonials, aerial maps, and excerpts from the Terminal Discernment volume. It was prepared not for publication, but for internal distribution to ecclesiastical historians and selected canon law experts. Only 3 recipients replied. The first thanked the group for their thoroughness but declined involvement, citing institutional obligations. The second acknowledged receipt and expressed concern, but suggested the information be reframed in the language of vocational grief rather than procedural failure. The third simply returned the packet, unopened. That summer, an unexpected event added urgency. A former retreat visitor, now a retired deacon, claimed to have encountered an older man in a rural bus station who addressed him by a seminary nickname not used since the late 1960s. The man wore a worn clerical collar and carried a weathered notebook. He spoke softly and asked only one question: "Did they say I was remembered?" Before the deacon could reply, the man stood and exited. He was not seen again. The question lingered. Had they been remembered? The growing body of evidence compiled by the Dillsborough researchers slowly attracted attention from a broader circle of institutional scholars. One such individual was Sister Madeleine Copley, a former archivist from a Benedictine house in Illinois who had spent the 1970s cataloging cross-diocesan training programs. While reviewing early drafts of the Dillsborough Ledger in late 1995, she identified a name embedded in the margins of one intake ledger, Brother P. Elian. That name, she recalled, had appeared briefly in records of a now-defunct clerical orientation initiative in 1957. The program known as Project Sanctus had operated under the premise of preparing non-compliant vocations for adaptive realignment. Project Sanctus had not been widely publicized. Funded jointly by several Midwestern dioceses, it was conceived as a corrective model for seminarians who exhibited liturgical irregularity or congregational hesitancy. Participants were removed from regular formation and placed under silent supervision. The program was terminated within 3 years. But internal memoranda indicated that certain elements had been transferred to a more suitable facility. Among the listed destinations was a rural site designated as SJR. Copley's contribution shifted the scope of inquiry. What had begun as an investigation into missing persons now veered towards systemic patterns of clerical filtration, selective withdrawal concealed under language of spiritual retreat. A new hypothesis emerged that St. Joseph had functioned not merely as a center of isolation, but as a procedural endpoint, a mechanism through which individuals could be effectively removed from the visible structure of the Church without confrontation, litigation, or formal dismissal. In autumn of 1996, a former diocesan procurement officer, under condition of anonymity, shared copies of inventory manifests dating from 1963 to 1971. The documents, preserved in a retired accounting ledger, listed shipments of materials to St. Joseph that far exceeded the reported needs of a small retreat center. Among the items were 12 triple-locked filing cabinets, 3 pallets of typewriter ribbons marked non-public code, and dozens of reams of indexed response sheets. No explanation was offered for the volume of supplies. None were ever returned or audited. That same year, a faculty member from a Midwestern theology department obtained permission to review an obscure collection of oral histories archived by a lay brotherhood based near Terre Haute. The interviews, recorded between 1981 and 1984, captured testimonies from former order members assigned to administrative support roles at regional ecclesiastical properties. One of these individuals, known only as Brother D, recounted his time managing mail intake at a pastoral containment site identified only as the Valley. He described routing all incoming correspondence through a single supervisor, blacking out last names, and discarding envelopes marked by familial distress. In one particularly revealing segment, Brother D spoke of filing internal memos that instructed him never to record outgoing mail without prior review. When asked how often approval was granted, he responded, "After the first month, it was assumed there'd be no more letters. The silence was considered healing." The interviewer asked if he had ever seen anyone leave. Brother D hesitated, then said, "There was a man once in his 60s. He walked the outer path for 3 weeks before they changed his status. After that, no more meals, no more morning bell. He sat still until they stopped asking." This detail aligned with several fragments gathered independently by the Dillsborough group. A ritual of stillness, a threshold past which voice no longer returned. It was not punishment. It was interpretation, the inward turning of vocation until it no longer registered on the administrative plane. Further supporting this view were fragments from a now-closed liturgical training site in Lafayette, Indiana. Stored among unused vestments and devotional texts was a typed syllabus labeled Spiritual Nullification and Reintegration. No author was listed. The document outlined theoretical models of obedience in extreme withdrawal, recommending periods of 40 days with zero verbal contact, followed by reintegration assessments conducted without physical presence. One passage instructed supervisors to observe from unseen stations. Do not reintroduce memory. Do not affirm self-reference. The loss of name is part of the passage. By early 1997, momentum behind the investigation had reached its peak. The Dillsborough group prepared a second document, narrower in scope, but more direct in tone. This file, known as the Interior Inquiry, was designed not for archival safety but for visibility. It included redacted witness accounts, shipment records, coded memos, and notations tied to at least 29 names. The intention was to deliver the document to a select group of ecclesiastical auditors, theologians, and administrative officials. A total of 12 packets were printed and hand-delivered. Only one recipient responded. Their former Chancery advisor, now living in academic retirement, offered a single-page reply. "What you've uncovered is not forgotten. It was never meant to be remembered." The following month, one of the researchers received an unmarked envelope at her residence. Inside was a page torn from a prayer book with a handwritten note. "Some truths remain in silence so long they forget how to speak." No return address. No indication of who had sent it. In spring of 1997, for reasons never publicly explained, the outer wall of St. Joseph was reinforced with a new line of concrete posts and an extended perimeter chain. Local records list the work as a weather-resistant security enhancement, though no formal contractor was cited. The job was completed in 3 days. Residents of nearby farms reported seeing plain black vehicles enter and exit the property during the work. No one approached the road. The bell tower, long dormant, was boarded up entirely. Attempts to obtain updated property records were denied. The county clerk cited a provision under religious land use exemption laws that allowed for indefinite non-disclosure if the property was used for sacred purposes outside public access. The phrase, while legally valid, only deepened the unease. In June of that year, a handwritten ledger surfaced in the possessions of a deceased cleric who had once served on the retreat's funding committee. The ledger included only numbers and dates, columns aligned with weekly notations. The names were omitted, replaced by initials. Each week, a small checkmark appeared beside the entries, but in some rows, beginning mid-1960s, the checkmarks stopped abruptly. Where they ended, a single letter was sometimes added. No codebook accompanied the ledger, but to the researchers, it signified a kind of finality, a moment where a presence no longer needed to be verified, a status shift too complete for return. That autumn, the Dillsborough group held its final recorded meeting. Membership had dwindled. Some moved on, others withdrew. One researcher relocated without notice, leaving only a file box marked vocation as silence, and a cassette labeled Final Notes. The tape contained a single voice reciting an inventory of names. At the end, there was a pause, followed by a question. Are you still listening? In 2001, a new archive law passed in Indiana mandated the digitization of land use and building permits older than 50 years. As part of this process, microfilm reels from the Jackson County office were scanned and catalogued, including a set of records labeled under Private Ecclesiastical Installations 1949 to 1979. Among the blueprints digitized was a folder marked SJEXT, which included an unlabeled architectural diagram showing subterranean space beneath what was presumed to be the chapel at St. Joseph Retreat. The diagram included a corridor not listed in previous known plans, running perpendicular to the chapel basement and terminating in 5 chambers, each identical in dimension. No ventilation routes were indicated, no exits shown. The file passed through a state-funded university scanning center, where an undergraduate assistant flagged the unusual geometry and submitted a side inquiry to the department supervisor. The supervisor, not recognizing the designation, archived the scan as unverified chapel extension and moved it to long-term storage. It would remain undiscovered for nearly 2 more years until a research assistant compiling data on historic cloister architecture came across it again. She recognized the initials SJ as matching other materials from the retreat. The rediscovery triggered a brief surge of interest among former members of the Dillsborough group, some of whom had remained loosely connected through academic forums. One of them, a religious sociologist now working in California, submitted a request for comment to the diocesan office responsible for historic preservation. The response was non-committal, referring only to heritage structures no longer in active use, and declining to provide comment on matters without contemporary pastoral relevance. But documents have their own persistence. The diagram, now public through an online archive, began circulating among researchers interested in patterns of enforced silence within religious institutions. Its measurements matched aerial survey anomalies noted in the 1990 land assessment. For many, it served as the first tangible indicator that the quiet space beneath the retreat had been purpose-built, not for reflection, but for retention. What followed was less an investigation than a gradual fading of resistance. By 2004, the retreat's legal trust had quietly dissolved. Ownership passed through a holding company for 7 months, then into the hands of a historical preservation board that did not list the property among its public holdings. On county maps, the area was designated simply as Non-Access Spiritual Zone. The terminology had no legal precedent, but was allowed under newly expanded religious land use protections. The outer wall remained. The gate, though unmonitored, was never opened. Those who lived near the retreat noticed changes only in atmosphere, less movement, fewer utility trucks, a steady decline in the appearance of maintenance crews. A postal worker reported that mail addressed to the retreat was no longer accepted. When a parcel arrived with no sender listed, it was returned with a sticker. Recipient status unknown. One question lingered more than others. What had been the long-term effect of this silence, not only on the men who vanished into its structure, but on the institution that built it? The answer came not from within church leadership, but from a symposium held in 2007 at a Jesuit university in Ohio. The topic, Institutional Memory and the Ethical Threshold of Internal Compliance. One paper presented, titled The Anatomy of Constructed Silence, used the St. Joseph Retreat as a case study, referring to it not by name, but by structural characteristics. The author, who had gained access to private testimonies from former administrators, proposed that such facilities did not operate outside the Church's logic, but from its most extreme interpretation. They did not violate doctrine, the paper read. They fulfilled it, to its most isolating conclusion. The response was subdued. Some attendees nodded, others looked away. None disputed the facts. Afterward, in private conversation, one faculty member remarked, "That's the real reason we don't teach certain cases. It's not what was done, it's that it was allowed to function as normal." By 2010, the site of the retreat had begun to deteriorate visibly. Satellite imagery showed roof collapse in one wing, overgrowth along former walking paths, and signs of erosion near the eastern fence line. But no demolition was ordered. No signs posted. It remained protected by silence. Even as the structure decayed, the idea behind it stayed untouched. Occasionally, someone attempted to breach the silence. In 2013, a retired priest submitted a letter to a theological journal recounting his brief stay at a facility of silence in southern Indiana. His letter, though cautiously worded, described the experience of being stripped of verbal contact, of having his confessions recorded not for absolution, but for assessment. He wrote of sitting in a hallway for 6 days without being acknowledged. On the 7th day, he said, his name was removed from the door. The journal declined to publish. A year later, the author passed away. His papers, donated to a university archive, included notes on a planned follow-up article. Its title, "The Corridor Without Return." The phrase had appeared before. It was found in a footnote within the Terminal Discernment Manual. It had been mentioned in the oral testimony of Brother D. It surfaced again in a marginal note scrawled beside one of the SJR intake forms, and now it remained etched into the private recollections of the last men willing to speak. The silence, once procedural, had become architectural, then environmental, and finally cultural. The final indication of institutional closure came in 2016, when the last known surviving official associated with St. Joseph, a former scheduling clerk, gave a brief interview for a diocesan oral history project. When asked about his time coordinating arrivals to the retreat, he answered with a faint, tired voice, "We kept no arrivals, only entries. The difference was intentional." No further questions were asked. The interview concluded. In 2018, a graduate seminar on archival theology at a university in Milwaukee assigned students a term-long research task titled Structures of Memory in Post-War Religious Institutions. One student, a former seminarian with ties to central Indiana, selected St. Joseph Retreat as his subject. He was unable to find any mention of the facility in public directories, diocesan promotional literature, or post-conciliar reform documents. When he contacted the archives of 3 Midwestern dioceses, 2 responded that no such site had existed under their jurisdiction. The third declined to comment, citing legacy status and spiritual closure. Undeterred, the student turned to topographic archives and historical land deeds. He located a copy of a 1961 survey that marked the retreat grounds as inactive reflection zone. Within the annotations, a single line stood out, "No ingress beyond perimeter, reflection enforced." The phrase placed in the margin lacked signature or citation. It appeared to function as both instruction and warning. The student's final paper traced the linguistic evolution of the word reflection, as used in ecclesiastical documents. From spiritual introspection, it had become, at least in one institutional context, synonymous with withdrawal, immobility, and absence. His conclusion was careful but unambiguous. What was presented as renewal was in fact removal. What was called silence was a system of forgetting. He received a passing grade. The paper was not published. That same year, a group of lay researchers attempted to crowdfund a documentary on disappeared clergy and institutional memory gaps. They named the project Valley of the Absent. Promotional materials referenced a network of former rehabilitation centers, with St. Joseph as the most enigmatic among them. Within weeks, the group's fundraising page was removed due to reported violations. No explanation was offered. The domain name they had purchased was later acquired by an unrelated spiritual travel agency. By this point, public interest had faded. The era of grand institutions was receding. The buildings remained, if only as markers on aging maps, but the practices that had animated them were no longer acknowledged. The generation of men who had worked within the walls of St. Joseph was nearly gone. Those who remained rarely spoke of it. When they did, their words fell softly, as if uttered in places where voice was no longer expected. In 2019, one such voice reached the inbox of a religious ethics professor in Chicago. An unsigned message, written in cautious language, offered 3 pieces of information. First, the bell was not destroyed, only muted. Second, the ledger still exists, though it is no longer stored on church property. Third, one of the 29 left the retreat grounds in 1978 under silent conditions and lives in obscurity under a different name. The email concluded with a single sentence. His silence is intact, but he remembers everything. The professor replied, asking for verification. The account was deleted before a response could be received. In 2020, a structural engineering team tasked with inspecting disused rural sites as part of a statewide safety initiative conducted an aerial scan of the area once marked as St. Joseph Retreat. The official report, filed with the Indiana Department of Safety, noted signs of subgrade instability and moderate risk of collapse. A suggestion was made to secure the area with visible fencing and warning signage. The recommendation was never implemented. Local authorities deferred to religious exemption codes. A journalist covering rural land use stumbled upon the report. She filed a request to photograph the site. The request was denied by the land's holding trust, which had no listed employees. When she attempted to access the area by foot, she was stopped by a local resident who told her plainly, "People don't go near there. It's not that they're not allowed, they just stopped needing to." A final set of documents emerged in 2022 when a retired diocesan archivist donated his personal collection to a university special library. Among hymnals, personnel rosters, and liturgical pamphlets was a thin folder labeled simply, "Held Entries." Inside were photocopies of 3 intake forms bearing the initials SJ, each marked with a different colored circle: green, amber, red. One bore a stamped notation: "Remain in observance. No release protocol filed." Also included was a small envelope containing a prayer card and an unmarked key. The archivist, in a brief handwritten note, explained only that the key had been taped to the inside of a file drawer at the retreat, beneath a ledger of unvisited sacraments. No indication was given as to what the key might open. The card included a handwritten phrase in Latin, "Silentium eius memoria est." His silence is his memory. With the passing of time, St. Joseph became less an institution and more a space between entries, a location carried not in maps but in absences. Researchers who once filled folders with careful annotations began to store their files less methodically. Some grew uneasy about their own participation, others accepted the story's arc as irreversible. The record did not conclude, it dispersed. Today, the property stands untended. The eastern wall, once reinforced, now leans with the weight of ivy. The cloistered walkways, once swept each morning, are layered in leaves and wind-blown soil. The bell remains silent. The names are no longer spoken. But silence, by its nature, is not empty. The files were never erased. The intake forms, however euphemized, were real. The families who never received answers still keep photos in boxes, write names into parish books and light votive candles with no liturgical response. Some do not ask anymore. Others have never stopped. And somewhere, in the margin of a personnel log, still filed beneath an inactive vocational code, is the designation SJR. A reminder, a footprint, an entry without exit. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.